Sometimes in blue states, we hear people say, I can't get anything done. Or if they're in a red state, I don't need to be involved. They're going to take care of it anyways. We would say you need to be there. You need to raise your voice, tell them your story, regardless of the political preferences of the legislature.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, a biweekly podcast with information on independent businesses' victories and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President of Advocacy. With a few exceptions, the November 5th election results are in, and today we're focused on what that means for small businesses. NFIB's Vice President of State Government Relations, Tim Goodrich, and NFIB's Senior National Political Director, Sharon Sussin, are here to discuss the results for NFIB's endorsed pro-small business candidates and explain what that means for state government legislative majorities and policy outlooks. Sharon and Tim, thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you.
Good to be here.
Sharon, given your role as the Senior National Political Director here at NFIB, can you talk a little bit about the candidate endorsement work that we do and how Election Day went for those candidates?
I'd be happy to. As you know, our program here at NFIB is all about identifying pro-small business candidates, finding ways for our members to engage with those candidates, and certainly, of course, putting effort on making sure our members vote on Election Day or before.
Right.
We like to say that Election Day is the last day to vote.
Right.
And so we put a very high premium on making sure our members have the information they need to be a pro-small business voter. So it's certainly our voter guide, which is our key election information driver, which we send to members that has everything from when to vote, if you can vote early, every state's, kind of different, when you can vote, and then, where we've made endorsements either through our state PAC or federal PAC, we've listed those candidates. So I was so pleased to hear from members in those last few days calling us up, I lost my voter guide, or I'm taking my voter guide to the polls. And so it's really, we're really proud to provide that as a great benefit to all of our members. Then it's about getting out the vote. And so we did a lot of emails to members and making sure they knew who the candidates were that were supporting small business. One of our biggest programs is our road team, where we had staff visit members in 6 states, visited over 1,500 small business members to talk about the election, reminding them to vote. And that was great interaction and engagement with our members, and it's a program that we're really proud of.
Yeah, and some NFIB members themselves were elected to Congress and in the state houses too, right? Sure.
We had, a handful in Congress and hundreds at the state level. I think at least, Tim, one governor coming in is an NFIB member. We're really pleased about that as well. Between our state and federal PACs, we endorsed over 2,000 candidates, and we have a 91% win rate.
Yeah, that's interesting. And why does NFIB encourage small business owners to run for office, and what does that mean for Main Street once they do?
There's no better advocates for our issues than have someone who lives those issues.
Yeah.
And that's a business owner, somebody who signs the front of a paycheck and knows what goes into making that payroll every week. And someone who's going to intimately know the issues that we're working on here in Congress, issues like the small business tax deduction and other regulatory and tax issues that are important to all business owners. We know that if they're living this issue, they'll be good advocates.
Tim, I'll put the same question to you. Your team is in the state houses meeting with office holders on a regular basis. What is the impact when small business owners take on roles in state government?
Well, I think Sharon really nailed it. It's similar to Congress, right? So in the legislatures, most of them are part-time. There's a few full-time legislatures, but most are part-time, which means they are folks that need to take time away from their real careers, whether that's being a school teacher, someone that's retired, you name it. And a lot of these folks don't have any business experience. So, when we come in as NFIB, our state directors go and lobby, and they're the voice of our members, it's always helpful to have somebody they're talking to that has run a small business and can talk about the impact of regulations on there or the impact of a new law, labor law. It makes the conversation easier. And during floor debates, especially to have a small business owner, you can't really argue with someone's experience. You can argue policy and you can say that they may not be right on what they believe, but you can't argue with what their experience is.
Yeah, there's an element of credibility that can only come from being a small business owner. As you know, increasingly there are more than just people on the ballots. There are now ballot questions, ballot initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about what those are, the process for getting those on the ballot, what our role is in NFIB on ballot initiatives, and what some of the more significant ones were this last election?
Yeah, so the ballot questions are continuing to be crucial to, it's not just the legislative process in some of these states anymore, it's also what gets on the ballot, particularly on the West Coast. We see this every year. California, the poor voters go in, and I've heard horror stories from, some years where it's taken them 20 to 25 minutes just to vote in the booth, let alone the wait. And they can't be experts on all these things, but they're increasingly asked to be. And so we've gotten involved at NFIB in these pretty aggressively, especially this last cycle. And it was an exciting turn of events for us. In California, we actually won 3 big issues. Retail theft, which is, I think everyone knows, has been a huge problem in California, around the country too, but specifically more in California. Raising the penalties for that, which will help. Another one that we won, we defeated a proposal that would allow local governments in California to implement rent control, which has not worked over and over again.
Right.
But the most exciting one was the defeat of the minimum wage. I was on here a while ago. We were talking about these types of proposals for minimum wage, and over 90% of these, when they get on the ballot for minimum wage, passed. This would have raised it to $18 in California, and voters said no. Mm-hmm. I think that's significant. Along with that, another ballot issue we were involved with was in Massachusetts that would have made the tip wage for bartenders, waitresses, waiters the same as the minimum wage. So it would have raised the tip wage. It would have essentially gotten rid of the tip wage there, and that was defeated. I will say that, some of our partners in the fight, that was a great grassroots effort, not just on our part, but, we heard stories of waiters and waitresses that were wearing T-shirts, as they served people, vote no on the proposal. So they saw the value. As employees, they make more in tips than they would make with the minimum wage. So those were some big wins. We did have a big loss up in Alaska. There was a kind of a 3-pronged ballot proposal there having to do with paid leave, raising the minimum wage, and captive audience, which, if our listeners don't know, that's basically saying that an employer can't express their First Amendment rights and talk to their employees about why joining a union would not be beneficial to them. Yeah. Unfortunately, that passed, and so that was a setback up there.
Yeah. Starting this week, our podcast will include an occasional promotion for relevant news, resources, or calls to action for small business owners and their supporters. After this short break, we'll be back with more from our guests.
The NFIB Small Business Legal Center's latest monthly webinar highlighted small business tax planning for 2025. The webinar is available now on demand and offers information on tax deductions and tax savings that every small business should know. To watch the free on-demand webinar, go to nfib.com/webinars.
Welcome back to the Small Business Rundown. Tim, we left off talking about ballot initiatives before we went to the break, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how those measures could change or impact small businesses nationally.
Yeah, so back to the minimum wage, I think the fact that we defeated proposals on a minimum wage in California and Massachusetts, which are 2 of the big labor states around the country, I really believe that's going to have an impact. I think that's sending a message that voters are saying enough is enough. Labor has overreached even in states like California and Massachusetts. And so I'm hopeful that as other legislatures look at these proposals, or if they have bills before them, this is going to be a pause button for them, and I think that's a big impact. On the flip side, we were talking about Alaska. Alaska is not necessarily a trendsetter, but it doesn't help that they've passed these labor issues. I think it will embolden labor to propose other types of ballot questions like this. They have in other states as well. We had one in Nebraska, paid sick leave, that passed as well. And I mean, you wouldn't think that would be something in Nebraska that would pass, but unfortunately it did. So we have to be very vigilant with these ballot questions. And I'm not our congressional expert, but I think where we have wins on some of these labor issues, it helps us at up on the hill.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah. Tim, now that Election Day is over and we're looking at the beginning of new legislative sessions across the country, what are some of the biggest changes that you'll see coming as a result of Election Day?
Yeah, so going into the election, there were 17 Democratic trifectas. And what do I mean by a trifecta? That means that the Democrats controlled the governor's office and both chambers of the legislature. The Republicans had 23, and then there were 10 states that had divided government, meaning Republicans might have one chamber and Democrats might have another in the governor. So, like Virginia would be an example where we've had divided government. We've got a Republican governor, and both chambers are controlled by Democrats. Coming out of the elections, there were two significant changes. The first was in Michigan. Republicans were able to flip the House from Democrat to Republican. And in Minnesota, they were able to get a tie, although in the last couple of days there's been some additional vote counting and there may be a re-election or a special election. So we're not sure how that's going to come out. But if that holds, I think that's good for small business in both cases because the trifectas were pushing labor agendas. And we have friends on both sides of the aisle, but, in some of whenever we get a trifecta, on the Democratic side, a lot of times labor really just pushes that agenda through. So having, mixed government or divided government is, I think, helpful in states where labor has a lot of pull. That's kind of the outlook politically as far as what's going to come on the agenda.
And are there any trends that you expect to see across state legislative sessions this year?
There are some trends. I think legislatures are going to respond to what's happening in D.C. with a change in administration.
Yeah.
The blue states are going to double down on their agenda. They're not going to be able to get labor issues and environmental issues that they pushed in D.C. through. So as an example, the green energy push, we're going to see a doubling down in some of these blue states where they're going to increase bans on natural gas, bans on diesel fuel, these types of things that we're going to have to be very active and asking our members in those states to step up and tell their story. I mean, if you're a landscaper and you've got 2 or 3 trucks, that's a big cost to say, okay, all of a sudden, no diesel, you have to switch to electric.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't even take into account your landscaping equipment and the leaf blowers and the lawnmowers and all of that. So it sounds great, but the practicality of it is it's a huge cost driver, and those issues, if they are successful in blue states, will literally drive people out of business because they can't afford the cost of switching their equipment over. And then in the divided states, I think we're going to see a standoff between labor and business, and we'll just have to see how that plays out. Red states, I expect the trends to be more positive in terms of tax cuts. We've seen a lot of tax cuts in the last 2 years. But we've also had some challenges, unexpected ones, particularly on tort reform. Missouri is a key example. Republicans had a trifecta there, and politically you would say, okay, that's going to result in some tort reform, but it didn't. And there's a lot of infighting within the caucus amongst the outgoing governor. Now we have a new governor coming in who's NFIB friendly. We've had some changes in the legislature there, some newbies that NFIB endorsed, and we're more optimistic about the outcome there.
Yeah, that's interesting, Tim. And you mentioned red states and blue states and divided states and the direction that different policies will go. You also mentioned that sometimes it doesn't necessarily reflect what the people following along would think, which is all the more important why it's about small business issues, not necessarily political party in the direction. So even if you are a Democratic landscaper in a blue state, you are still a small business voter and you need to make your voice heard. So along those lines, how can small business owners find out more and get involved in small business policy priorities in their state?
Well, the first thing they can do is go to NFIB.com to find out what the priorities are for their state. Each state has a state director that represents small businesses. We also have grassroots managers that work within the state, and they work with NFIB members to help them raise their voice, whether it's with the media or testifying in the legislature. If they have personal relationships with those legislatures, they can help facilitate those types of meetings.
That's great. Before we go, anything from either of you that we've left out?
I would just add, I've been talking to a lot of people since the elections, and, there's some folks that are really happy about the outcomes and some folks that aren't. And one of the things that, we talk about is right now, if you're a small business owner at the federal level and in most states, it's like going into court. You have a judge that's friendly, you have a jury that's friendly. That doesn't mean you're going to win your case, and you got to be there to make your case. And the same goes for those who are unhappy, even though it might be a a judge or a jury that aren't as friendly, that doesn't mean you're going to lose your case. So you got to go in there and make your case. So, sometimes in blue states, we hear people say, I can't get anything done. Or if they're in a red state, I don't need to be involved. They're going to take care of it anyways. We would say you need to be there. You need to raise your voice, tell them your story, regardless of the political preferences of the legislature.
Absolutely. Our work never stops. How about you, Sharon? Anything as we close out the year?
I'll tell you, 2025 is going to be a busy year. It's, we call it the off year, but when you have a new administration that is already identifying, several House members and senators to serve in the administration, that means in the House, special elections that are going to be this spring. I already have a meeting request for a candidate. So, we met with 103 congressional candidates for this cycle. We're ready to start up for next year. New Jersey and Virginia have those off-year elections. They're going to be electing governors. And before you know it, it'll be the 2026 midterms, which are very, very important. The majorities in the House are slim right now, so we want to make sure we engage our members very, early, again, like in the state level, to build on and leverage those relationships that we have and do what we can to help engage and elect all those small business friends again.
That's a great point. We appreciate you both coming on to help us unpack the elections we just witnessed and get ready for next year and see what's on the horizon. I appreciate the time.
Always great to be here, Adam.
Thank you.
In today's show notes, you'll find ways to take action on issues that matter to small businesses in your state. You'll also find links to a fact sheet on this year's general election and more information on running for office or how to get involved in electing pro-small business candidates. If you have a question you'd like to hear on an upcoming episode of the podcast, please email us at podcast@nfib.org. And now I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.